It depends on what the meaning of the word is. You probably recognize that famous quote, right? From that massive 1990s political scandal. Well, what's absolutely wild is that this little legal dodge actually, totally by accident, managed to sum up one of the greatest philosophical breakthroughs of our time. I mean, we all think we know what a fact is, but today we're going to see just how fragile that little tiny word really is.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am so excited to get into this material today because we are taking on a massive philosophical hurdle. We're talking about the infamous is-ought problem, also known as Hume's guillotine. And by dismantling this centuries-old puzzle, we're going to uncover a pretty mind-bending truth about reality itself. Let's get started. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the unbridgeable gap. Then, the fragility of is. Third, the conscious foundation. Fourth, bridging facts and values. And finally, answering the critics. Section 1. The unbridgeable gap. Hume's guillotine. Okay, so if you're like most people, you probably have a pretty common sense view of how facts and values work, right? Like they exist in totally different universes. We essentially split our worldview into two buckets. On the left side, you've got your rock solid is, facts, science, observation, cold hard logic, stuff you can test. Then, entirely separate from that, on the right side, you have the kind of squishy ought, our values, ethics, prescriptions, and social norms. And that strict separation right there, that establishes the foundation for Hume's guillotine. The philosopher David Hume famously pointed out that moral philosophers have this bad habit of leaping from what is to what ought to be, without giving any real logical justification. It's like you literally can't just observe a fact out in nature and somehow mathematically deduce a moral rule from it. This creates this huge intellectual mystery. Moving from descriptive facts to prescriptive values seems like an illicit, logically impossible leap. It's this massive gap that reason alone just can't cross. But what if the problem isn't actually the leap itself? What if the problem is the ground we're leaping from? Section 2. The fragility of is. Breaking the bedrock. All right, let's shatter this illusion that these so-called facts are some unbreakable objective bedrock. Take a simple statement. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. I mean, that feels like the ultimate undeniable fact, right? But in reality, making that statement relies entirely on filtering out a massive amount of real-world messiness. To even say that, you literally have to ignore atmospheric pressure, the specific isotopic makeup of the water, dissolved substances, the whole shebang. So this fact is really an idealization. We're just filtering the real world out to make a pragmatic, working model. Let's look at another one. Even stating something as basic as the sun is a star relies completely on human-shaped classifications. I mean, star is just a category we invented to group phenomena together. It's completely 100% dependent on our own theoretical frameworks. So the crucial takeaway here is that is statements are never this perfectly neutral view from nowhere. Not at all. They are deeply conditional tools, and they're forged for a very specific purpose. They depend on our definitions, they're contextually qualified, all other things being equal, they are model-bound, and honestly, most importantly, they are inherently anchored to present consciousness. They aren't these timeless anchors just floating out in the void. They are practical tools built by human minds. Which naturally brings us to a pretty critical question. Just take a second and think about this. If these supposedly objective facts aren't the solid bedrock of reality that we always thought they were, what actually is? Section 3. The conscious foundation. A new paradigm. To rebuild our worldview from the ground up, we have to introduce a concept called cogito presence. Now, this is simply the undeniable knowledge of your own existence at the exact moment you are thinking about it. That immediate present awareness, that's the primary certainty. It is literally the absolute only undeniable foundation we have. Everything else, whether the past actually happened, if the future will happen, the reliability of your memory, the continuity of the laws of physics, all of that requires further inference. It requires justification. To really wrap our heads around this, let's conceptually zoom out for a second. Try to imagine a totally mindless, pitch-dark cosmos, just empty. Not a single conscious entity exists anywhere. Well, in that universe, there are absolutely no facts at all. Zero. Why? Because without at least one observer to formulate or interpret or verify a claim, truth-apt propositions literally cannot exist. In a dead universe, the word is completely loses its meaning. Facts absolutely require awareness. So, if facts require awareness, how does that completely change the game for us? Section 4. Bridging facts and values. dissolving the gap. Now, this is where things get really fascinating. It turns out both our descriptions of the world and our prescriptions for it originate from the exact same conscious field. Our refined is statements, they just serve our need for navigation, prediction, and coordination. And our ought statements, they aren't just made up, arbitrary opinions. They actually develop from the intrinsic goals that are literally built into conscious existence. They serve different purposes, sure, but they spring from the exact same shared ground.
You see, once we realize that facts are just activities happening within conscious life, values start to emerge naturally as structural features of that awareness. Conscious systems necessarily exhibit built-in structural preferences. We prefer persistence over annihilation. We prefer coherence over fragmentation, flourishing over diminishment. These aren't just floating moral opinions we made up. They're basically the built-in operating system of any conscious being that exists over time.
So, transitioning from an is to an ought isn't some illicit, sneaky, logical leap across an unbridgeable chasm. Not at all. It's simply an expansion of coherence from our shared conscious ground. Cogito presence doesn't logically deduce ought from is. Instead, it proves that the supposedly neutral descriptive bedrock was never actually autonomous to begin with. The gap completely vanishes because, well, the two sides were never truly separate.
Section 5. Answering the critics, the reality check.
Of course, a paradigm shift this massive is going to invite some serious skepticism, right? So let's punch through this first wave of objections and see how this framework holds up to a rigorous reality check. Critics love to say this collapses into radical subjectivism. Oh, everything is just an opinion. But the reality? Acknowledging conscious dependence doesn't destroy objectivity at all. Shared truth and science remain robust achievements. We're just being intellectually honest that they are the achievements of conscious agents, not some magical view from nowhere. And if a critic says, well, pointing out contextual dependencies is trivial, we just remind them that this proves the classical is-ought gap rested on a completely overly idealized version of is. What about the claim that this doesn't solve the logical deduction problem? Well, it actually dissolves the premise entirely. Both arise within the very same conscious domain. And what about the final objections? Some folks argue this undermines our knowledge of the past or the future. No way. It fully supports extended knowledge. It just demands proper epistemic rating, meaning we acknowledge that the present moment is our highest certainty, and everything else scales out from there. It actually builds intellectual resilience. And for those who worry that morality suddenly becomes a hostage to subjective belief, don't worry. The universal drive for aware flourishing gives us incredibly objective anchors for evaluation. Because let's face it, not all beliefs are equally coherent or sustainable for a flourishing consciousness.
Let's bring all of this together with one beautifully simple yet profound thought. Is and ought are categories of articulation. They are not brute features of some unspoken, mindless cosmos. Without a conscious mind, the universe is just silent. But with consciousness, both facts and values are born together. They're intertwined right from the very first spark of awareness. Which leaves us staring right at the profound reality of our own conscious experience. If present awareness is the absolutely only undeniable bedrock of reality, what will you choose to build on it today?